Welcome to The Explainer. You've probably heard the word reparations thrown around, and with it, some absolutely mind-boggling numbers. So today, we're going to peel back the layers on one of those numbers, a really big one, and figure out where in the world does it actually come from.
Okay, here it is. $14 trillion. I mean, just look at all those zeros. It's a number that's so huge it barely feels real, right? But this isn't just some number pulled out of thin air. No, it's actually tied to a very specific and very significant proposal.
That's right. That number represents the estimated high-end cost for a legislative proposal for black reparations here in the U.S. And believe it or not, as we're about to see, it's actually not the only estimate that's in the trillions.
So that brings us to the big question, right? Where does a number this massive, this astronomical, actually come from? Let's dive in and unpack that, because to get it, you've got to look at how the math is actually done.
All right, first things first. Before we even touch a calculator, we need to understand the why. We have to start where all of these proposals start. And that foundation, the core reason cited by advocates, is something called the racial wealth gap. So what is the racial wealth gap? Well, it's this idea of a major difference in wealth between black and white households. And we're not talking about just yearly salary here. We're talking about total wealth. You know, things like owning a home, investments, savings, basically the financial cushion that families build over generations. And the argument is that this gap is deeply rooted in history.
And this really gets to the core of it. The argument from proponents is that this wealth gap we see today didn't just happen by chance. They say it's a direct result, an economic echo, if you will, of slavery and systemic racism. And that's the jumping-off point for trying to put a dollar figure on it.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, how on earth do you turn centuries of history into a specific dollar amount? And that's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? It's a really complex process with a few key moving parts. And if you change any one of them, the final price tag can swing wildly.
It really comes down to these four main steps. First, you have to agree on that historical context we just talked about. Step 2, you have to somehow quantify all the financial harm that happened over generations. Step 3 is a big one. What do the reparations actually look like? Is it cash? Is it programs? And then step 4, you have to decide who would even be eligible. You can see how tweaking any of these would totally change the final number.
Let's zoom in on that second step for a second, quantifying the harm. This is where it gets super complicated, because it's not just one thing. People who do these calculations are looking at a whole bunch of factors, like the wealth that was lost from slavery itself, but also the impact of things like housing discrimination, decades of unequal pay, and being shut out of educational opportunities. It's a massive, layered economic puzzle.
And then there's step 3, the scope of the programs. This one is huge. What form do the reparations actually take? Are we talking about direct cash payments to individuals, or maybe land grants? Or does it mean massive investments into black communities, things like new schools or healthcare programs? As you can imagine, the cost of cutting checks is going to be very different from, say, funding a nationwide education program.
So now that we have the building blocks, let's put it all together and see how different people using different approaches end up with these wildly different numbers. We're going to check out 3 well-known estimates to see how this plays out in the real world.
Okay, take a look at this. Pay attention to that middle column, the basis for calculation, because it's the engine driving the final price tag. For instance, if you base the math on that historical 40 acres and a mule idea, you get a number around $3 trillion. But if you take a different approach, like the economists Darity and Mulling did, and your goal is to close the current wealth gap, well, that gets you to $10.7 trillion. And then you have Representative Cori Bush's bill, which proposes this really comprehensive program, and that's where that $14 trillion figure comes from. And this bar chart just makes it super clear, doesn't it? The sheer scale we're dealing with here is massive. And these aren't just slight variations in math. They are completely different calculations because they start with different goals. Each of these bars is basically a different answer to the fundamental question, what exactly are we trying to repair?
So, okay, we've looked at the how and we've seen the different estimates. What's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, it's that the whole debate over the cost, it's not really just about accounting or arguing over numbers. It's about something way deeper, something more fundamental.
At the end of the day, every number we've talked about, whether it's 3 trillion or 14 trillion, comes from tackling this one central challenge. It's the challenge of trying to put a concrete price tag, a monetary value, on the incredibly complex and painful economic legacy of history. You could almost call it an exercise in economic translation.
And that really leaves us with the question that's at the very heart of this entire conversation. It's not just if, but how. How can a society even begin to quantify the economic fallout of centuries of its own history? And what would it actually take to repair it? That, right there, is the multi-trillion-dollar question. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.